Here we are in Adobe Animate. So Animate has gone through a long process with Adobe and the interface, getting comfortable with the interface and the tools. So that's the idea of this particular lesson. So here is the startup screen, and in the startup screen we can start new files based on different canvas sizes and devices, because Animate is not just for animation, it's also for web development too. So a lot of times banner ads that you see, like this banner ad right here, are created in Animate and put on web pages, and so that's one of the purposes of Animate. Another purpose of Animate is to do full broadcast animation. Some of the cartoons that you see on Cartoon Network, for example, are created in Adobe Animate. So there's a bunch of different ways to create new files, and there's purposes for those new files. So if I choose Create New, there are different types. So if I wanted to make a character animation, social media, gaming, education, ads, these are different categories. We're on the web category here. There's also an advanced category. With ads, there are different ad sizes. These are default ad sizes, education, gaming, and social, and character animation. So we'll just use the web, and I'll just choose a medium format. And here are the details. You can do the width and the height, and you can change the frame rate, and then the platform type. So this is crucial. So the platform type now is either ActionScript 3.0 or HTML5 Canvas. And there are these different types are important. So with ActionScript 3.0, you can do all the animations that you want. With HTML5, it's a little limited. And it's limited because essentially what's going to happen to the file is going to end up being a lot of JavaScript and styling and HTML. It's going to be the output. And it's going to create a canvas file, and that canvas is going to be generated with a lot of JavaScript, and so therefore it's a little bit more limited. So we're going to choose the ActionScript 3.0 format here, and I'll just go ahead and click Create. So immediately this should look like a familiar Adobe application to anyone who's used Adobe applications in the past, where you have a set of panels. And there's a toolbox on the left-hand side, kind of like in Illustrator and Photoshop. There are several panels on the right, again like Photoshop and Illustrator. And then at the bottom here is our main timeline. So when you're talking about animation, when you're talking about video, there's always a timeline involved. So each one of these little squares or rectangles is a frame. So we started off with a document that's 24 frames per second. So if I go to this particular frame, that's 1 second. And that will continue down the line for whatever animations that we're creating. This properties panel will change. It's dependent upon what's selected. What's currently selected right now is the document. So it's all the document settings that we saw previously. So the width, the height, the frame rate, and all the other settings that have to do with the frame. Also, next to the properties panel is the library panel. So everything that you create inside of Animate is going to be stored in the properties panel. And what gets stored in here are things like audio files, symbols, graphic assets. Anything that will be stored in here, you'll find in the library panel. And we have additional panels loaded here. So there's an align panel, there's a color panel, there's a swatches panel, there's a transform panel, etc. And all of these panels you can find also in the window menu. So every single panel is located here, again, just like all the other Adobe apps. So there's some additional panels that you can get access to. There is also workspaces. So right now we're in the Essentials workspace, but there's also different workspaces if you want to explore those as well. And you can make your own. So Animate is for making animations. And in order to make an animation, you have to start off with some objects. And the way that Animate works is that it's vector. Everything that you draw initially with these tools inside of Animate is all vector graphics. And the reason why it's vector graphics is because it keeps the file sizes relatively small. So when you export your movie as a SWF file, those files are very, very small, no matter how detailed the graphics may be. So another example of a vector application would be Adobe Illustrator. And so we have things in here that are familiar with that tool. So we have, rectangle tools, we have an oval tool, we have a polygon tool. We have also these selection tools. There's a direct selection tool and a sub-selection tool, just like we do in Illustrator. So some of these tools might be familiar to you. So the process is you could either build all of your assets in Animate and then animate them, or you can import your assets and then animate those. So rather than having to build anything here for what we're trying to do, I'm going to open up a file that I've created ahead of time. And I'm going to change the view here to fit in frame so we can see the entire thing. So, and I'll go to the document setup so you can see the document settings is 1920 by 1080, which is a standard video file format. And this is set to 30 frames per second, which is pretty high for animation. Typically, anything that's animated can go from 12 frames per second all the way to 2997 or 30 frames per second. Depending on the frame rate, the more frames that you have, the more detailed the animation is going to be, the smoother the animation is going to be. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So on this particular timeline, I have this image of a TIE fighter, and I have a star field in the background. And the star field is just, right now it's just a graphic. And you notice that I go into my library, I have all these assets loaded here. So the star field is just a JPEG file. The TIE fighter as a PNG file, but I've also converted that into a graphic symbol so that it can be animated. And then I have another layer here called sound, and I'm going to import a sound particularly for that layer. You can see that that sound is in the library panel. So this timeline, the way that it works is that this playhead will travel across the timeline when you play it, and whatever the playhead is over, it will display that within the frames. So right now you can see in the timeline from frame 0 to frame 100, all the assets are on the timeline. So let's say that we wanted to do an animation that goes from 0 to 100, and we want to have the TIE fighter move across the screen. So the first thing I would do is I would select the TIE fighter. And then in order to do an animation, there's different types of animations that we can do. We can do frame by frame, which is pretty tedious. In this case, we're going to utilize tweening, which is automatic animation. So if I right-click anywhere on this particular layer, it has a motion tween already on it. You can see there's an option here to remove the motion tween. And you can also see that the color of the layer is a little different than the rest. So what that means is that I can go to a specific frame. Let's say I go to frame 55. And I can move the TIE fighter across the screen. And you'll see that I get a couple things. First of all, anytime you see a dot, that's a keyframe. So the first frame is always a keyframe by default because that's your asset's beginning. Now I have a secondary keyframe, and I also have this motion path. So the motion path indicates, right now it indicates the speed, and it indicates any kind of tweening variables that are involved in the actual animation. So if I scrub through the playhead here, you'll see that the TIE fighter actually moves across the screen. Now there are some playback controls here in this area of the timeline. So I have a play button, and I have a step forward and a step backward button. So if I click play, it'll actually play through the animation. Now you notice up here that it's showing me that the document's at 30 frames per second, but it may be playing at a speed that's different than 30 frames per second. Depending on, you can see there that it dropped to 15 frames per second, and it dropped to like 8 frames per second. So this number is the ideal number, but depending on your computer's capacity, your computer's RAM, and other factors like GPU performance, that animation may not play as smoothly when you're previewing it here. So you can see that it's kind of slowing down for me. Another way that you can preview the animation is just by hitting the return key. The return key is the keyboard shortcut for that. And then you can use the step forward and the step backward also. Okay. So right now I just have this basic animation, but if you want to improve it, if you double click on the layer, not the layer name, but the layer itself, you have these easing controls. So what this does is shows you on an axis what the animation is doing. So it's starting here and it's ending here, and this straight line indicates that it's just going from point A to point B. There's no additional variations that are involved. You can see there's an option here to add easing, and there are some easing controls that you can add. So if we look under simple easing, that you can use slow, medium, or fast. So if I choose fast, you notice that changed the shape and it changed the curve. So if I go ahead and play through that now, you can see what that did to the TIE Fighter. Now I'm not sure why it flattened out here. So we can try a different one. We can try fastest, we can try slow. So there's a bunch of different options to choose from just to change the animation. And if you want to test your animation, there's also an option up here where you can test the animation. What that does is it exports it into a SWF file, and you can preview the animation. Okay. So as we go through these tutorials and in these lessons, I will highlight some of these tools. We'll talk more about timelines and animation. We'll talk more about the different panels and all the options that are involved in them. But for right now, this is just a kind of an overview of what we do inside of Animate and how the interface works and what you can do inside of Animate.